This is both a very exciting and a very frightening time, I think, because effectively, whether AI is good or bad, and there's a tendency for everybody to treat AI a bit like a football team. It's something you've either got to support unquestioningly, or you've got to hate violently for no rational reason. Actually, whether it's good or bad entirely depends on the frame of mind in which people adopt it. Because in one way, it's tremendous news for gaining greater appreciation of and improvement of customer experience, and then leading to customer experience-led growth, because it's kind of like the potential for a spreadsheet, but for words and feelings rather than just numbers. And we've always suffered from the problem of quantification bias, which is money. This is why, salespeople get paid a lot more than customer service people. It's not because they're more valuable, they're arguably less valuable. A lot of the value they lay claim to be honest, may have actually arisen anyway. But anybody who can effectively describe their value in numerical terms or financial terms always effectively gets the whip hand over people who do something which may be more valuable ultimately, but is either harder to quantify or slower to emerge. And so you always have a double bias, actually, with quantification bias, which is people favor numerical metrics over, for example, softer metrics, but they also favor fast metrics over slow metrics. So generally speaking, I think it's fair to say that practically every single business underinvests in customer retention. Not because it's not valuable, it's because it's slow to prove. And that's the optimistic side, that we can actually rebalance things a bit because we can provide, really, really useful measurement around things which aren't simply crudely numerical. In other words, thoughts and feelings can actually stack and scale and aggregate alongside numbers. And that's great. The terrifying thing is that the bill for AI is going to become due. Loads of people will want to sell a lot of AI to a lot of businesses in a hurry. If you look at OpenAI, by the way, at the moment, something like 80% of its revenue comes from ChatGPT. I think that's right. 80% of its revenue comes from consumers. They're going to look to businesses, obviously, to try and repay their investment. What's the easiest way to do that? You sell it on the basis of cost savings and automation. And that's, again, the same problem, that cost savings are immediate and quantifiable, whereas value creation is deferred and a bit uncertain. And when given the choice between those two, finance people will almost always prefer the former. So there is this terrifying prospect which we need to be alert to, which is that effectively it's quite difficult to compete with shit and free. Okay? You can compete with cheap and shit by being good and expensive, but shit and free is a formidable kind of catnip for anybody who's just desperate to make their quarterly forecast. So that's the bit that worries me. I've called this optimized for surprise. And I suppose my contention here is that, here we go. Experience-led growth is actually the best kind. It's also, I think, often surprisingly cheap if you're prepared to do it differently. And it's often the best way to create differentiation for all kinds of reasons. And that's something which I don't think we make nearly enough effort towards, which is, I was just having a conversation backstage earlier about the whole business of sort of standard metrics that are used. And I said, yeah, that's great. No, I like the metrics. They're useful as a kind of measure of comparison. But if you're going to be a brand, you should really have some metrics which are uniquely yours. In other words, it's not just what makes us good, it's what makes us us. And one of the things that always concerns me, I dealt with a company in San Antonio who had these very strange little electric vehicles that shuttle people around the town. It's called the Local. And they said, we need a metric that effectively captures what makes us different. And my slightly whimsical suggestion was, well, your vehicles are slightly comical and weird, and the whole experience is unfamiliar. Why don't you just measure how often a customer laughs in the course of a journey? Perfectly reasonable. It wouldn't be a good metric for British Airways business class, perhaps, but it's a perfect metric for little electric vehicles shuttling you around San Antonio. I think that's also true of human beings, by the way. You know, if you want to be an individual, you have to have some measures of success that you've defined yourself. You know, if you want to be a sculptor and your parents want you to be a lawyer, you know, you've got to hold fast to what makes you, you. And the other thing is, the other reason why I'd always overinvest in customer experience and customer service is that it's actually quite easy to be good at it. I know that sounds ridiculous. The standard is so low, right? I was talking to some people at AO, and they said, we've actually got nearly 1 million Trustpilot ratings and an average of 4.9, which when you think about it is unbelievably high. And they said, 90% of that is just because we tell people what we're going to do, and then we do it. And people go, fucking hell, that's extraordinary, right? And by the way, this has much wider economic importance. Because if a toaster's shit, let's say you buy a particular make of toaster and it's not very good. The brand is sullied, but toasters as a whole aren't. If you go and buy something online and you have a bad customer experience online, the entire behavior is sullied. It doesn't get confined to you. And one of the problems I think that's happening is that people are not transacting online to anything like the extent that they might because of fear of a customer service nightmare. In other words, people are once bitten, twice shy. The way we react to uncertainty and failure isn't proportionate. Okay? Let's say you've got a 98% approval rating on eBay. Now, logically, economically, someone might look at that and go, well, basically, 2% of the time, whatever I order won't turn up. But on the other hand, they're 10% cheaper, so logically, okay, a 10% saving for a 2% chance the thing doesn't turn up is a logical thing to do. If humans were as economists thought humans were, that's exactly what would happen. And you probably could actually arbitrage that a bit by going on eBay and buying from untrustworthy sellers that are large things. The way real humans operate is that once you drop below about 97% on eBay, nobody will buy from you under any circumstances at any price. It's not a price-trust trade-off, it's kind of table stakes. Fundamentally, if you don't trust someone, nothing else happens. And I think it's an evolutionary mechanism. I think we've just evolved to punish people who effectively behave towards us in an unfair manner and to punish them disproportionately. Because if you think about a working society or tribe, that's actually a policy that works pretty well if you were to model it. And I think, by the way, it's very interesting. So my great fear is that there's a whole online economy which isn't growing at the rate it should because people are basically, they're once bitten, twice shy. It's not your fault. Your customer service may be brilliant, but if my expectation of online customer service is that there's a 30% chance it's going to be a living nightmare, okay, I'm not going to transact at all with anybody in that whole channel, which is why I'm so interested by Octopus Energy's policy of basically most of their advertising budget goes towards telling people how good their customer service is. Because they've got everything else right. Okay, you know, price is good, it's a great brand. I do tease Greg Jackson occasionally as an advertising guy because they were originally supposed to be called something like Green Tech Energy. And it was a weird requirement that they called themselves Octopus. And I always tease Greg as a marketing person by saying, if you'd gone with your original name, you'd only have about 17 customers. Half the appeal, let's be honest, is the pink octopus. How many people have a stuffed, cuddly pink octopus from? Nobody? Okay, I've been to Octopus Energy events and you see people leaving fighting over the goodie bag. Branded merch, by the way, don't underrate it. It's fantastic. Okay? But I always think their policy of basically saying our customer service is great makes complete sense. If you think the biggest bottleneck to people adopting the product is this fear, which is, well, I'd quite like to do this thing online, and it all looks very good and it's very, very sustainable, but I'm terrified of that, you know, that lost weekend of, you know, playing call tag or whatever. I think what they're doing is really, really good. And by the way, I've spent 30-something years in advertising, and I'm going to say something which isn't really doing me any favors, that a personal experience in terms of our assessment or appraisal of a brand or a business, particularly a personal experience at a timely moment, trumps anything you can do in advertising. And I know this from my friend Alex Batchelor, who used to be the marketing director of Royal Mail. And they spent millions, I mean hundreds of millions, improving their service quality, and then discovered there was actually no correlation between the objective quality of a service in an area and how much people like Royal Mail. And Alex had a theory and went and tested it and found out that there was one leading determinant of anybody's attitude to the Royal Mail brand, which was whether they liked their postie. Okay? You could have FedEx levels of efficiency, okay? And if your postie was a miserable bastard, right, nobody really liked Royal Mail. Equally, you could have a pretty shit service, but if the postie was the kind of person who went, I knew you were on holiday, so I put it in the back porch, you thought it was the best business in the world. Because let's face it, there's a beautiful phrase. I knew a guy called Mark Fox who used to run Starbucks in the UK. And he said, I think marketing is a load of shit, he said, more or less. He said, but there was one sentence I heard at a marketing meeting which I've never forgotten. It's not just what people think of brands, it's what people think brands think of them. And we're highly sensitive to how we're being treated as an individual. And we should almost think of advertising and marketing as a two-way street. It's not just what the public thinks of a brand, it's what they feel the brand thinks of them. Very strange business, by the way. I discovered recently there's a whole cohort of people who don't go to Marks and Spencer's, not because they don't like their prices or what they sell, but they don't like the people who shop there. Okay, right? Actually, got to confess, I'm a bit like that with Gales. Anybody else? Okay, I really quite like the product, but the people in the queue, no. If I ever did a mass shooting, that's what, no. Sorry, I didn't say that. I didn't say that, okay? The point of differentiation, it's quite easy to differentiate yourself with customer service, either by making it quirky, just by being really competent, by being a bit friendly, by being a bit charming. We're actually starved of this kind of thing. What we really want as humans is to feel that we matter to someone else. More than money, more than an awful lot of urges, that's the fundamental thing that kind of makes us human. We're effectively, great book, by the way, if anybody's got a spare weekend, The Primate Myth. It effectively says humans aren't really psychologically apes at all. We're bodily descended from them, but our psychology is closer to dolphins or elephants or other herd species than it is to actually bonobos or chimps. Which is good to hear, because bonobos and chimps are basically fucking arseholes, okay? Right, whereas dolphins and dogs are actually quite nice, okay? It kind of figures, the whole theory makes sense when you think about animals that you tend to like. Cats are a bit of an outlier, but I suppose if you like watching documentaries about psychopaths, liking cats kind of fits into the same pattern. But differentiation is important because of this wonderful book, which I still think is one of the best marketing books, Positioning the Battle for Your Mind. The argument is that there's not much point in being number 3 or number 4 or number 5 in a category, because there's a winner-takes-all effect. In every business, that's the Dirichlet distribution, that's kind of bar and sharp stuff. In other words, the winner in any category enjoys disproportionate advantages over everybody else. Therefore, if you can't be number 1 or 2 in a category, the best thing to do is to differentiate and create a category of your own. Because it's better to be number 1 in a smaller category than number 5 in a big one. Now, my friend Nassim Taleb makes the point that this is only getting worse because globalization and hyper-competitiveness increases this winner-takes-all effect, where all the gains go to a smaller number of players in any particular game. It's happened in books, for example. The average money earned by an author correcting for inflation is about the same as it was in 1955. Until you take out Dan Brown and J.K. Rowling, at which point all the other authors are about 30% worse off. The winner-takes-all effect is massively exacerbated by the size of the network. And so the importance of either being number 1 or 2 in your category or finding your own category in which you are perceived as different but better, okay? That becomes the new way to win. In other words, find something else, differentiate yourself, and be good at being different. Anybody here a fan of Moxie Hotels? No one? No. Okay, I always love that because it just... anyway, I'll come to that later. It's a thing I call reverse benchmarking. Don't do the thing that other hotels do. Instead, do what they do quite badly really well. Okay, and I'll come to more of that later. But this just strikes me as, whoops, that's odd. I'm pressing the wrong thing here. Oh no, got it, fine. There's a fundamental problem, I think, with benchmarking and with the fact that more and more companies like to compare themselves with everybody else without noticing the downside of that, which is you become more and more similar to everybody else. And when businesses become more and more similar to each other, everybody loses, okay? The businesses lose because they actually are engaged in cutthroat competition, usually on price, with 3 other businesses which are just like theirs. The shareholders and investors lose because the category becomes less diverse and therefore the value of the overall category falls, and the consumer loses because they have less choice. And you might even argue that the employee loses because they don't have a choice of different places in which to work. It's all the same shit. Trust me, I worked for an advertising holding company. You know, it's basically quarterly reporting with a sideline in advertising, as far as I can see. A lot of things, when everybody else does the same thing, they're perfectly rational to do on your own, but they don't work when everybody else does the same thing. And that's a really important, we don't really have a word for this. I mean, an economist might call it something like the tragedy of the commons. But these things which make perfect sense at an individual level, but are silly if everybody else is doing the same thing. And so, you know, one of the things I always notice is that, you know, there was this huge trend in retail, bigger is more efficient. And at the time, remember, small shops were a bit crap. So when you went to a Tesco Extra, you thought, oh, this is amazing, they got everything. I grew up in Wales, where there wasn't even a Sainsbury until about 1985, and we go to these huge supermarkets and go, God, this is fucking amazing, okay? And then they become even more efficient still by having self-service checkouts, you know, minimizing the personal level. It's all efficiency, scale efficiencies. And then what happens? People start going to farmers' markets instead. Now, a farmer's market is totally stupid until, if you think about a farmer's market, you've got to pay 7 times to buy 8 different things. You're out of doors, and weirdly, you're paying a premium to buy direct from the manufacturer, okay? In economic logical terms, it makes no sense until you understand it as a fundamental reaction to effectively the way in which the retail direction had. Waitrose said to me once, they said, we never really opened hyperstores. Actually, we wanted to, but we didn't have the money, and we were kind of lucky. Because they're actually a pain in the arse, aren't they? Unless you want to buy 500 things. You know, okay, they've got a bit more of what you want, but they've got a ton more of what you don't need. Also true of airports, by the way. What happens is everybody follows the same rational thing. Let's turn our airport into a shopping mall. And in the early days, when I was a kid at school, you know, all the rich kids had come back from Schiphol or Dubai airport. Oh, it's incredible. I bought a Walkman. It was amazing, okay? And eventually, every fucking airport becomes like blue water with some planes. And you go, have you been to London City Airport? It's fucking incredible. There's hardly anything there. And you get to your plane in 3 minutes. So some aspect of the human brain is novelty seeking. We actually enjoy what's different. We actually notice and appreciate contrast much more than we do standardization. You know, when I was a kid, London City Airport would have been thought of as a bit of a crap airport, you see? And, you know, farmers' markets would have seen, geez, Grandpa, what the flaming hell are you doing this, right? In the 1970s. It's because you get too much of one thing. Everybody basically optimizes around some common set of metrics. So without noticing that in the process, they're becoming more and more alike, and they're actually creating a market opportunity for doing the opposite. It's a bit politically incorrect, this. Apologies, it's not my quote, okay? But Sir James Goldsmith always said, when a man marries his mistress, he creates an immediate job opportunity, okay? And in the same way, when everybody becomes overly committed to one course of action, you create effectively a job vacancy in the opposite direction. And so it's also true of politicians. I think a large part of the success of Donald Trump or Nigel Farage, and equally including that Jeremy Corbyn or the new Green Party leader, okay, is just that they don't talk. All politicians are told when you appear in the media, they all have media training, and they all talk in exactly the same way, and they're all trying to say exactly the same 5 things, and they never admit to ignorance, and they never admit to uncertainty or anything like that, and they never go off the cuff. Perfectly rational if you're the only person doing it. suddenly all politicians sound the same, and the second someone comes along who sounds a bit different, whether it's Boris or Nigel or, but equally Jeremy Corbyn, okay, people go, oh, this is different. And so that importance of just being different, it's also quite cheap. It requires a degree of courage because everybody else is telling you not to do it. But as a way of actually gaining attention, it's spectacularly inexpensive. And this is the fact that we find it difficult to do. This all comes down, funnily enough, he was talking about investment strategy here. We are, in a way, more paranoid about our reputation or looking stupid or social embarrassment than we are about really, really important things. Okay? The extent to which we're unbelievably hyper-attuned to what you might call social conformist signals. There's a great book, by the way, called The Status Game by Will Storr. If you get a chance to read that, it's an absolutely fantastic game. That we always have this kind of calculus of, if I do this, how does it make me look? And we were sort of joking about this upstairs, but I said, well, the weird thing is, Elon is now totally unfashionable, right? Because he said some bad things, and I completely agree with that, okay? On the other hand, if you're actually a consequentialist, you go, well, he has actually converted the entire mode of transportation by car to electricity, and he's given the entire surface of the planet access to high-speed internet access. If we look at it purely from what you've actually done, from that calculus, rather than the calculus of is it fashionable to like him, you'd come to a different verdict. I'm being a bit sympathetic because you retweeted me yesterday, so I'm feeling a bit defensive, okay? But this point of John Maynard Keynes, it's often better for the reputation to fail conventionally than to succeed unconventionally. There's a similar phrase of Warren Buffett's where he said, even though the collective behavior of lemmings is utterly stupid, there is no recorded case of an individual lemming being singled out for blame. But we were all jumping off the cliff. And humans have this instinctive feeling that if I go with the herd, I'm unlikely to suffer social embarrassment or sanction or anything else. And so it's our natural default mode of behavior. And so what I'm saying here is that differentiating through customer experience, through almost, I'm going to say, gratuitous eccentricity. Actually, I'm going to say gratuitous eccentricity. It's actually really, really easy. AO is the largest buyer of cuddly small bears in the UK. When I met John Roberts, who owns AO, he'd just written a cheque for £1 million to buy a new supply of bears. Because AO delivers themselves, they deliver their own stuff because it's a washing machine, they keep a box of bears in the back of every van. And if the customer has kids, or in one case when I was riding on the van, a dog, they just give the customer a bear. It's a few pence. It's a rounding error. It's impossible to calculate the value of that, but nobody else gives you a bear, okay? And I know. So actually, I'm going to say this quite seriously. Being a bit silly about something is very, very hard to argue for, but it's an extraordinarily cheap way of actually standing out. I mean, this is one lovely example. I only learned this from John Evans, who does Uncensored CMO. The reason... Has anybody heard the story? Oh, the reason the label's so big is it catches the drips on Angostura bitters. That was a post-rationalization. Actually, the person who designed the label wasn't talking to the person who commissioned the bottle. So they ordered labels that were too big for the bottle, and they just thought, oh, sod it. Now, that's the single differentiating factor of Angostura bitters, which is why you'd never buy a competing brand, because it's not really, I don't know how many pink gin drinkers there are in the room, but it's not really proper if it doesn't have a label that's too big for the bottle. I mean, that's gratuitous. The Doubletree cookie. Anybody stayed in a Doubletree hotel? Yeah, the fascinating thing about that cookie is that I last stayed in a Doubletree hotel 17 years ago. I can only remember two things about the experience. It was in Chicago, and I got a cookie. That's it. Right? And 17 years later, if someone says, do you want to go and stay at the X or the Doubletree, and everything else is equal, 17 years after that incident, I'll choose the Doubletree. Now, the problem is it's quite hard to argue for something like that, because it is gratuitous and it's arbitrary. But the very fact that it's gratuitous and arbitrary makes it different. I mean, this is an idea that's probably been worth $1 billion to American Express. I think Ogilvy had the idea when working with American Express. I'm not entirely sure. It may have been somebody else. Member since. Now, by the way, in any interaction with a customer, if you acknowledge the length of the relationship, okay, it doesn't cost you anything. There are certain things where you can make people feel great which cost nothing at all. It's a bit like getting to board the plane first. Right? Someone's got to board the plane first, obviously, because if nobody boarded the plane first, you get stuck at the gate. So don't just let random people board the plane first. Make people feel special by boarding the plane first. It doesn't cost you anything. In fact, they'll even pay for the privilege. And so this was a case where simply by acknowledging that people are very reluctant to give up their Amex card because they don't want to lose their continuity of service. They don't want to go to member since 26. In fact, we know this because every now and then Amex, by mistake, issues cards to existing card members with, say, member since 26 rather than member since 97. It's something insane, like 40% of people ring up and demand that their status is... Now, this is an interesting thing. This is another case of brilliant differentiation. Has anybody come across this? Magic Castle Hotel in LA, absolutely nothing special. It was a 1940s apartment block. As you can see, the architecture isn't exactly distinguished, but weirdly, it's always on TripAdvisor, somewhere in the top 20 hotels in LA. And they've got a few other little shticks, but their main one is the popsicle hotline. It's just a red phone by the pool. If you've got kids in the pool, they can go and pick up the red phone. Someone immediately comes out with what we call ice lollies. They call popsicles on a tray, and the children can just choose a popsicle. That's it. Nah, it's a bit more than that. I think the customer service there is really good. I don't think it's just a crap hotel with a popsicle hotline, but it's this gratuitous thing which weirdly you probably talk about 10 years after you stayed there. Do you remember that hotel where, again, gratuitous, slightly silly. Anybody familiar with Kano or Kano theory? A few people, good. I think this is really important. He was a professor at the University of Tokyo, worked with the consumer electronics industry in Japan, and he argued that products, but I would also argue this also applies to services, have three types of attribute. There's the basic one, which is table stakes. If you're selling milk, doesn't matter how good the milk is, if the carton always leaks, no one will buy it, not doing the job, game over, you're dead. Then there are performance attributes, which tend to be the things that people measure and which get the most attention and investment. And that would be if you were selling a cassette deck, it'd be battery life, sound quality, volume, wattage, all those kind of things. And there, the investment in better performance is kind of, the payoff is linear. Probably tails off at a point where actually the differences become slightly nugatory or impossible to perceive. But then he created this third category of things, which he just calls exciters. Presumably whatever it is in Japanese. And these are the things where they are usually weirdly peripheral or tangential to what the product or service is about, but they make people go crazy. So the classic example, this is going to confuse half the audience here. If you were buying a cassette deck or a DVD player, right, the eject mechanism was a delighter. Okay, it was pretty much irrelevant to how the machine performed as a cassette. Does anybody know? A DVD player, okay? Okay, it was pretty much irrelevant, but people set extraordinary store by these kind of gratuitous little details. If your cassette deck just went clack when you pressed a eject, you thought, what a piece of shit. If it had some sort of damping mechanism with a cantilever effect, we thought, oh, there's more. There's even, I think there's a section where Alan Partridge goes into an electronics store, nice action. And this reached such a height that DVD players, often you could open the DVD drawer with the remote control. Now, okay, when you think about it, that is of absolutely no value whatsoever, unless you're the world's most accurate discus thrower and can actually get a DVD to land in the machine from the other side of the room. It was basically so you could demonstrate the action of the opening. And by the way, I was talking to some people in the car industry. There are fundamental problems, I think, with European luxury car brands in China because the European luxury car brands tend to value sort of Teutonic minimalism, and the Chinese absolutely love in-car gimmickry. And so there's this cultural divide if you're trying to sell, Western luxury cars in the East, which is that everybody is trying to strip things down, whereas in China, people go, well, I'm paying a lot of money for this car, and there's hardly anything in it. Okay, and there are brilliant delighters like the fact. Interestingly, someone was saying that actually, Skodas actually have a bit more bling in them than Audis do, for example. But this theory, I think, is incredibly useful because I don't think we process everything about a product in the same way. There's the bit which is, oh God, it's shit, it might be awful. That's just a deal breaker, you could say. Then there's the performance attribute, which we tend to talk about. And then there are those weird things we really, really love, even though, strictly speaking, they're not central to the function of the thing. Having a cookie when you check into a hotel isn't in anybody's sort of, core service level agreement. Nobody would ever say, I quite like my hotel, but I wish it would give me a cookie, okay? But I had an argument with someone else in marketing about this, about the value of market research, where I said, the things people really, really like are things they didn't even think of asking for. So nobody in market research, bit of a bloke example here, apologies, but nobody ever said to a market researcher, I quite like my barber, I just wish he'd flick burning methylated spirits into my ears, right? There was literally no demand for that until it happened. It's kind of weirdly, perversely enjoyable, I should explain, just to anybody who doesn't understand. But how strangely, the reason is it burns your ear hair. That's the reason it's done. But not a single person would ever have requested that, okay? It's kind of cool because it's almost gratuitous. And so the problem with these things, they're actually quite easy to do if you've got the freedom to be silly. Particularly if you're a founder-led business, you're a privately owned business, you can do these things. If you're in a PLC where every cost has to go through procurement and God knows what else, they're easy to do, they're incredibly powerful, they're easy to do externally, incredibly hard to do internally. And this is a book I recommend to everybody, which is on the pros and cons of quantification. Because in many cases, it's very, very hard to justify these activities, even if they're really powerful. But this guy's a Vietnamese-American philosopher at the University of Utah. And the brilliant subtitle there, and this I think applies to benchmarking as well, How to Stop Playing Someone Else's Game. It's very, very easy in a business to get so obsessed with some particular metric, which you've usually inherited from a firm of management consultants who've sold exactly the same metric to every other client they've had in the last 6 months or 6 years, okay? Effectively, what you're doing there without realizing it is you're playing someone else's game. How you score things is unbelievably important. I'll just give the example I always give, which fascinates me, is the whole game of tennis only really survives because of the totally wacko scoring system of sets and so forth. If you had a game of tennis which was scored like basketball, it'd be unwatchable, wouldn't it? Because once one player was 25 points ahead, the other player would basically lose interest in the game. They'd lose all their motivation. You get Federer leads Nadal by 106 points to 84, and people would just go to the pub. But because you break it into these sets, there are a whole load of bits of genius to the scoring system of tennis, which we're not even consciously aware of, but they make it watchable. I don't get basketball. I agree with that person who said of basketball, why don't they just start with 100 points each and play the last 5 minutes of the game? Because that seems to be pretty much what happens, to be absolutely honest. But that's a great book. The other problem is defining everybody in a very narrow way by a very narrow function. And you've probably heard me talk about the doorman fallacy, which is this business that you have a hotel doorman. What will happen is some consultants will come in and say, how much do you pay your hotel doorman? And they'll say, well, we can save you that with the installation of an automatic opening door. What they've done without realizing it is they've defined the function of the doorman as opening the door. That is part of the function of a doorman, but it's probably only 20% of the value that person creates. There's security, there's recognition, there's hailing taxis, there's exchanging information with other doormen about dodgy people who are around. Okay, there are all sorts of things a doorman does. What tends to happen is when people want to automate a role, they completely narrow down the definition of what that person does to a point where it becomes amenable to being replaced by machinery. But what they're doing there is they're claiming the credit for the cost they've saved without actually being held responsible for any ensuing costs or opportunity costs they create. So in other words, you have a lot that pretty much describes procurement, by the way, how to claim the credit for any money you save while being completely absolved of any blame for any bad consequences that result. It's a completely asymmetric, does anybody here in procurement? Okay, I think it's an asymmetric function and it shouldn't really exist. If you want to have a proper business function, there needs to be skin in the game. In other words, yes, you make the decision, you claim the credit, but you also live with the consequences. And I think separating those things out is kind of catastrophic. Now, what's going wrong here, I think, and this is, I think, another example of procurement, okay? If you search, one of the funniest things you can do on Google Images is you search for Sainsbury's car park or whatever, okay? And you will get 100,000, not quite, you'll get 1,000 photographs, all from local papers, of someone really angry in front of the entrance to the car park. And this is the kind of thing which is happening. Now, this is M&S car park in Sevenoaks, where it's an automatic number plate recognition system. This guy is very angry, rightly so, because the automatic number plate recognition clocks your arrival from the moment you drive in. Then you fart around and eventually find the app to pay, and you buy an hour's parking. Your app then tells you you've got 60 minutes left, but you haven't, you've got 55, because the countdown started the second you drove into the car park. Now, nobody who grew up in the 60s, 70s, 80s, 90s, or even 2010s thinks that the definition of when parking starts is when you drive into a car park. It's when you get out of the car, right? Now, you have people being fined because they drive into the car park, have a row about whether to go to Marks & Spencer's or not, decide not to go to Marks & Spencer's and drive out. Now, they don't think they've parked, okay, because they think parking is getting out of the car and leaving it unattended. But the ANPR, which is the automatic equivalent, thinks that parking is just driving into a car park. And this is what happens here. So people get really pissed off because they get fined. How has that happened? M&S, I venerate M&S. It's a brilliant, brilliant business, right? How do they do that? Well, it's very simple. Someone decides to outsource the management of the car park to an outside provider. The provider that always wins the bid for procurement is the one whose business model basically is most dependent on fining people as a source of revenue, because you make a lot more money fining 2 people than you do by charging 30 people legitimately. So you find a supplier who's basically incentivized to annoy your customers, and you give them the contract to run the car park. And then you deny all knowledge of it, because that's in the lift at M&S in Sevenoaks. Don't come to us. And that's a classic example of procurement screwing over customer experience to an extent which really, really pisses people off. Now, there's a brilliant lesson from Disney here, as you'd expect, in fairness. Disney has this issue where kids queue up for 2 hours to go on some ride, okay? And at the beginning of the queue, it says this is the minimum height, but they get, going to chance it. And of course, they get to the end of the queue after an hour and a half queuing, and they're measured again, and they're told, I'm terribly sorry, legally we can't allow you on this ride because you're half an inch too short. Now, Disney has a brilliant phrase which every single customer-facing organization could adopt. It said, it's not our fault, but it is our problem. Just because it's not our fault, i.e. you ignored the thing at the end of at the beginning of the queue, and you decided to chance your arm, they go, but still, we have an unhappy customer. So it's our problem, even if it's not our fault. And they have a wonderful system, which is you get to the front of you, I'm so terribly sorry, you can't actually go on this ride, but since you've already queued, here's a voucher so that when you come back in 6 months' time and you're half an inch taller, you can go straight to the front of the queue. Now, that is real customer experience genius. Understanding that if your customers are pissed off, falling back on appeals for parking charge notices cannot be dealt with on site, and I have to email appeals@smartparking.com, okay? That's saying it's not our fault. Fine. If you read, anybody read Dan Davis's book, The Unaccountability Machine? Effectively, an enormous amount of business activity is effectively directed towards blame evasion. It's actually become a cultural thing, which is, as long as I can define this as as long as I can say, no, the parking operator, we're not, it's the M&S car park. Everybody thinks of it as the M&S car park. The only reason you park there is to go to effing M&S, right? But technically, they've got away with it because the operator of the car park is someone else. Sorry, I don't think that works. And so this is my great thing. Too many people can claim the credit for cost savings without actually ever paying the price. And this is the other one. I mentioned that fact about the American Express member sins. Okay? A lot of the time, not everybody, not all the time, not in every category, but a lot of customers think of themselves as being in a business relationship. If you get letters of complaint, I'm willing to bet that the leading opening paragraph of a letter of complaint is, I have been a customer of yours for X years, imagine my surprise when. Now, technically, legally, that's irrelevant, right? Whether someone's been a customer for 8 years or whether they just joined, their complaint should be treated exactly the same. Nonetheless, the feeling of outrage they'll experience is totally different. Because we think that with every ongoing transaction or month of membership, of year of relationship, we earn effectively what you might call extra benefit of the doubt. Yeah. Amazon does recognize this very intelligently. Basically, if you're a regular customer and you haven't returned very much and you haven't claimed anything's gone missing and you've bought quite a lot of things, Amazon will give you the benefit of the doubt. A friend of mine actually was given a second hi-fi for that. And then when the first hi-fi turned up, Amazon didn't even want it back. Okay? That was the level of benefit of the doubt. If you're a brand new customer, well, how do we know you're not a scammer? Okay? And consumers instinctively know that the nature of a relationship changes with each ongoing transaction. But businesses, finance people, just look at the business one transaction at a time. They don't look at it longitudinally. And that's what I mean by saying the customer's often after a marriage, and your CEO, your finance director, your CFO, actually has the mentality of someone running an escort agency. You know, in other words, everything's a standalone transaction. It's not part of an ongoing value exchange over time. Now, obviously, we don't expect a relationship if we stop at a motorway service station, unless you stop there incredibly regularly, okay? But nonetheless, an awful lot of business relationships, the person thinks they're in an ongoing relationship, and the reason they stay loyal, member sins, etc., is because they think, I am now establishing myself as a trustworthy customer, and I expect to be treated accordingly. But this is why this is so important. The really good metric for any business has to be repeat purchase. Has to be the best metric for a business that really stands to survive, is if someone does it, do they do it again? And actually, by the way, I'm very interested in the whole conversion to electric cars. And the really, really interesting thing about electric cars is not the pace of adoption, which is all the statistics you read. It's that practically everybody who actually makes the jump to an electric car, J.D. Powers is basically recording sort of 98% satisfaction. A vanishingly small number of people would be willing to move back again. And the stickiness of the new behavior is more important than the speed at which the behavior gets adopted in the first place. It's a bit like air fryers, you know what I mean? Nobody really wants them, but is there anybody here who's got an air fryer and then got rid of it? No. Oh, there's no going back. You know, it's one of those things. It's just irreversible, you see what I mean? And so understanding that part of behavior is absolutely essential to knowing to what extent you've got a resilient business, I would argue. So, little tips here. If you want to be fundamentally differentiated, the first technique is reframing. Look at the same information in different ways, or look at completely different information. Don't benchmark yourself against everybody else. Because how you look at information affects how you emotionally respond to it. So the first trick to look at in any customer experience thing is there a way in which the objective reality remains the same, but the emotional response is completely different? And the example I always give about that is, we worked a bit with the people who do sort of home care, and occasionally they'd be late because they have an obligation. If there's a single parent or an elderly person who doesn't have heating or hot water, they have to service them first. And they were worried because this caused customers to get angry because the service care person was late. I said, just tell them the reason, okay? Now, there will be 1 in 100 arseholes, okay, who'll go, I don't care, okay? But if you're I'm terribly sorry, we've got to be 2 hours late because there was an elderly lady 2 miles away whose hot water isn't working, and we have to give them priority. Most people you'd want as a customer will go, no, fair enough, I wouldn't want it any different. That's fine, I'll work around it. Instead, they just go, we're late. There are quite often, simply by presenting exactly the same objective reality in a different way, you can achieve a kind of magic. You can even turn negatives into positives. One of the most underused tricks in business is asking your customers to do you a favor. Weirdly, we like people more when we've done a favor for them. So I said this to an airline. I said, seriously, if you ring up your customers, you're overbooked on one flight to New York, or you're underbooked on the 9 p.m. flight. If you ring up your customers and say, look, you don't have to, you're already booked on the 9 p.m. flight, but it would help us out if you went on the 10 p.m. flight. Weirdly, as a consequence of doing that, they like you more. Now, you'll have to read my book to explain why I think it works like that. There's a magical formulation which a friend of mine used. He worked at Goldman Sachs for many years, and he said, if you want someone to do something for you, the phrase to use is, I wonder if you can help me. You leave it open-ended, and you say, you help me. What you've done in that phrase is you've created a volunteer, not a conscript. I then discovered, after he told me this trick, that was exactly the same phrase that Ted Bundy used to pick up his victims. Okay? So you can use these skills for evil as well as for good. Okay? But this is the thing that absolutely fascinates me. On the inside, it's a speedometer. You're all familiar with that. Miles per hour. That arbitrarily is how we always present the data. Distance per time, meters per second, kilometers per hour, miles per hour. You're going at 10 miles an hour, and it'll take you an hour to go 10 miles. Accelerate to 20, you save half an hour. Accelerate to 30, you now only save 10 minutes. Accelerate to 40, you're now saving 5 minutes. Accelerate to 50, you're now only saving 3 minutes. If you're already going at 70 on the motorway, and you go, oh my God, I'm running late for my meeting, and you accelerate to 80 for a meeting that's 10 miles away, you are saving less than a minute. It will make no effing difference. Now, it's only when you present the information this way that certain things suddenly become obvious. For example, it shows really why high speed 2 wasn't necessarily a bad idea. It just didn't have to go that fast. Because by going at 220 miles an hour, all the engineering, everything, if you're going faster, okay, the fuel consumption, energy consumption goes up exponentially. Risk of an accident goes up exponentially. Braking distance goes up exponentially. Energy involved in acceleration goes up exponentially. All of those things get worse and worse exponentially, but the time you're saving is basically flatlining. And most people, it never occurs to them. They go, oh, I'm going 70. Jesus, I'm running late. I better go 85. Now, the other thing that actually it suddenly showed me, which never occurred to me until I've been presenting this for about 6 months, was it suddenly explained why the bicycle was such an important invention. See? Because if you think, let's imagine you live 10 miles from work. Well, on a bicycle, you can probably get to work in half an hour. Okay? If you're walking, it's going to take you about 3 hours. So the bicycle isn't that big a deal in terms of MPH, but in terms of time spent to go a set distance, the difference between walking and a bicycle is probably bigger in a way than the difference between a bicycle and a car, for shorter distances. And so this technique of reframing, of take the same information and present it in a different way, genuinely, humans do not respond to objective information, they respond to how it's presented. And this is the example I always give, which is the London Overground. It was always there, always existed. It was called Silverlink Metro. No one used it. It was a network of railway lines. What they did is they just pretended it was a tube line. They called it the Overground. They added it to the tube map. Suddenly it became part of Londoners' everyday repertoire. On the day it appeared on the tube map, I think usage went up by like 50% in a single day. I'm being a bit unfair here. It now carries as many people as the Elizabeth line. In a day, the Elizabeth line cost £20 billion. This rebranding cost, with a few improvements, in fairness. There was a bit of rolling stock investment. There was a bit of investment in a few extra miles of track to connect 2 other lines. But that actually cost 200 million, 1% of the cost of the Elizabeth line, but it carries as many people. It's actually a marketing story. It's not really an engineering story. It's just they had the same information, they found a new way to present it. Anybody else like this? I absolutely love buses in London. I love going by bus, right? I really enjoy it. You can look out of the window, it's really, really pleasant. But some arse, right? All it says on the bus is a number and the final destination. I've lived in and around London for, I don't know where Clapton Ponds is. I mean, as I said, the only reason I can think of is, to go to Clapton Ponds is probably to dispose of a corpse or something, right? I've no idea where it is. Now, what I want to know is, where does the bus go in between here, where I am now, and Clapton Ponds? Because if it goes to Charing Cross, Waterloo, Victoria, Farringdon, St Pancras, but basically, there are 7 stations from which I can get home to Kent. Okay? If the bus stops at any one of those stations, I'll get on that bus. But I don't know, because it goes 32 Clapton Ponds. I mean, genuinely, what you don't see, this is a great problem with finance. All they measure is the costs and revenue of the business they're already doing. They don't measure the lost revenue from presenting information badly. And I genuinely think that buses have become utterly useless. I mean, it's fine if you commute, because it's worth the efforts to memorize the bus timetable and the route network, okay, on your route to work. But buses for ad hoc use have become more or less useless, because there's no information, unless you're prepared to stand at a bus stop for ages and do some research. That's a marketing problem. It's nothing to do with and loads of people are probably looking at the data going, people don't like buses very much. Right? I love buses. I just can't understand them. And so the second thing is, marketers, everybody in customer service, okay? Bit of a tip, don't sell what you do. Marketers have made this mistake. They always justify their existence by what they do, and they become a function. Instead, as a marketer, sell your value to the business by how you think, not what you do. Okay? Because marketers think about things in a fundamentally different way to almost everybody else in the organization. Customer service people think about it in a totally different way. If that point of view is not represented on the board of a company, what we've allowed marketing to be presented as is as a kind of nice to have, as an optional extra icing on the cake. It's not that, actually. The real value of marketing is if you don't have a marketing mindset in the room when a decision's made, you can make really stupid decisions. But we've never sold marketing on the, if you don't think this way, you can make very bad decisions. We've always sold it as something, as an optional extra, as an add-on. In fact, I would argue the marketing mindset, the way of looking at the world that marketers have, is actually essential to developing any kind of business strategy or any really important business decision-making. But instead, we've been allowed to be reduced in most organizations to a kind of support function. And I think we have to get that back. Third thing is this final tip. How long have I got? I haven't got a clock here. Am I running out of time? 5 minutes? Okay, this is my little tip. It's a game anyone can play at any level, senior, junior, you've got a small budget, you've got a big budget, you've got no budget at all, you can still play this game. And it brings me back to what I started to talk about. This is a book. Has anybody read it? Okay, this is a fantastic book. It's a guy who actually took his restaurant in 11 Madison Park to the #1 restaurant in the world in the San Pellegrino Restaurant Awards. He originally started off in 2011, I think, at number 50 out of 50. And by 2017, he'd taken the restaurant to #1. And when he'd had that slightly humiliating experience of being the 50th best restaurant out of 50, which is still pretty good, he took his team to the best restaurant in the world, according to the San Pellegrino Restaurant Awards. And all of his team started jotting down notes about what they really liked and what they wanted to copy. They were benchmarking. Ooh, I like that thing with the napkins. We could do that thing in the bathrooms, da-da-da-da-da. At the end of the meal, Gadara just said to his team, I thank you very much for your list of things you'd like to copy. We're not going to do any of them. One, because we can't afford to do many of them, but two, because they're already doing them. So he said, I've got a different question to ask. Given that this is a Michelin 3-star restaurant, the best restaurant in the world, what wasn't very good? What was a bit meh, right? And they came up with two things. The coffee was just okay. By the way, that's weirdly often the case at really fancy restaurants, isn't it? The coffee's shite, okay? And secondly, about a third of the people in the party, typically the chefs he'd brought along, wanted to drink beer, not wine, and they were treated really shabbily compared to the wine drinkers. The wine drinkers got a sommelier and a load of tasting notes and a load of bullshit, and the beer drinkers were just told, yeah, we got Sam Adams and something or other on draft. So he goes back to his own restaurant, doesn't change anything else. He appoints two guys. One of them is now the coffee sommelier, and the other guy is the beer sommelier. And now you imagine you ask for a beer in that restaurant and they've just got in some amazing artisan beers that are limited editions with tasting notes, food pairing suggestions, and your beer preference is treated really seriously rather than making you a second-class citizen. And so I think that's absolute genius. And it occurred to me that what he's doing there is what I call reverse benchmarking. Don't copy the competition. Find something the competition hasn't noticed, doesn't measure, doesn't care about, culturally can't do, isn't very good at. Double down on that thing and make a lot of noise about it. And it suddenly occurred to me that this business of reverse benchmarking is much bigger than I realized. It's what Steve Jobs did. Everybody in the computer industry, load of nerds, Silicon Valley, I've got so many K of RAM, okay? And everybody was asking the question, what can a computer do? And Steve said, what does it feel like while you're doing it? What does a computer look like? Is it beautiful? Aesthetics, usability, and fundamentally emotional factors were completely neglected in that community. Take the thing that everybody else is ignoring, double down on it. Uber, same thing, right? Everybody else is looking at a whole load of metrics about taxis. What Uber used technology to change is what it feels like to wait for a cab. Okay? Does anybody else do this slightly egotistical thing where you actually wait for the cab to be drawing up before you walk out of the building because it basically makes you feel like Louis XIV, you know? You know what I mean? Or rather, it makes you feel like Kaiser Soze at the end of The Usual Suspects. You know, there's a bit of a power play in walking out of a building and having a car draw up, okay? So it changes the feeling of waiting for a cab. It also, by the way, changes the feeling of paying for it because you don't have to fart around at the end of the journey to get receipts. So what they did is they doubled down on all the things that nobody else was thinking about at all. They didn't compete head-to-head. They found something else that someone else had ignored, and they doubled down on it. My friend, a wonderful guy called Adonis Kachelis at Ogilvy, is a practitioner of this, Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu. So apparently, Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, he said, that's reverse benchmarking. Because this guy in Brazil wanted to invent a martial art. Now, the problem is that lots of people in Asia have been inventing martial arts and perfecting them for about 1,500 years. So it's quite difficult to come up with, a new one. And then he had this sudden insight. All the martial arts in existence teach you how to fight when you're standing up. No one's produced a martial art for how you fight when you're on the ground, which, to be honest, in a pub car park setting, is a more valuable skill, isn't it? I mean, if you're there having a scrap and someone's shouting, leave him, John, he's not worth it, okay, being able to fight on the ground is probably the more valuable skill. But again, Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu was just, what does everybody else do? As a consequence, what have they overlooked? Let's do that thing. And it occurred to me, let's just play this game, hotels, right? I'm a huge fan of things like the Moxie, Citizen M. I've stayed in lots of hotels, some swanky, some really cheap. Not one hotel, even for money, has offered me a monitor in my room. I spend more time in my room working than I do watching TV, but not a single hotel in the world that I know of has said, if you like, we'll bring up a 34-inch monitor with a USB-C cable, and it'll make it a lot easier to work. Okay? I'm not saying I'm some sort of day trader. I'm old. I can't see that well, right? Okay? I'm long-sighted. Never happened. And all it is that nobody's thought of it. And similarly, if you took car hire, we were talking about this again earlier, the weird thing is, if you book a taxi to pick you up to the airport, it's a 60 quid taxi. They come and meet you at arrivals, and they've got a sign with your name on it, and they push your trolley if you're feeling a bit lazy, right? But that's 60 quid. You rent a car for 600 quid, and so you go and find your way to a desk, and, the car park, it's cars parked in bay 207. And you get in the car, there isn't even a laminated bit of paper which says this is how you open the fuel filler cap. So, 300 miles later, you're standing in baking heat at some Spanish gas station, and you're actually looking at YouTube, okay, to find out how you open the filler cap. Genuinely, what happens is that John Maynard Keynes thing, people would rather fail conventionally than succeed unconventionally. Everybody copies their business from everybody else. All you've got to do, the very act of benchmarking, as I said, when a man marries his mistress, awful quote, but you get the point, okay, creates a market opportunity in the opposite direction. Or every single metric, I think, the optimization of every single metric Fundamentally, there's a great thing, Goodhart's law, anybody heard it? Any metric that becomes a target loses its value as a metric. And you can exploit Goodhart's law by going, what are they all overweighting here? Because if they're overweighting that, they're underweighting this. And that's created a space for us to play in. And I think many of the most interesting businesses in the world have inadvertently just done or deliberately done a reverse benchmark. So that's my point. If you reverse benchmark, the great thing is what you do will be something that people didn't expect, and also they'll talk about it. So I probably better end here. My father was quite stingy, but he owned 3 Dyson vacuum cleaners bought from new, 1 on each floor of his house. I didn't say quite explicitly, Dad, you're really stingy. Why have you spent a 4-figure sum on vacuum cleaners? I quizzed him a bit. It all boiled down to one customer service experience. He'd been missing a part, and he phoned Dyson, and they answered the phone, and they sent the part out, I think, by DPD, and it arrived the next day. That moment on, basically, he wasn't buying anything else, because it was like a trust bomb. Now, there is an American branding agency which talks about this. They call it a brand quake. Customer experience can do something which advertising very rarely can do, which is a complete brand quake. You have an experience which is so memorable, so unexpected, so distinctive, okay, that it basically changes your mind about everything. It's very, very hard to do. An individual customer personal experience is probably the best way to do it. But the final thing is, when I say optimize for surprise, what makes us happy is things we didn't expect. Politeness is discretionary effort. Generosity is discretionary expenditure. If you optimize everything for efficiency, you create no surprise. So that's what I mean by optimize for surprise. Optimize for surprise, practice reverse benchmarking. And finally, I'm actually sponsored by the Welsh Tourist Board. No, I'm not really. I always argue, and see what you think about this. Okay, philosophically, I always say, if you're English, the best place to go on holiday is Wales. And the reason is because all of you think it's going to be a bit shit, and then it isn't. Okay, right? Is that fair? Has anybody had that experience? Yeah, exactly that, okay? So in some ways, I always find it really interesting that how good something is, how memorable it is, actually it's not just about how good it is in some arbitrary sense. It's how good it is compared to an expectation level. And so the problem with surprise is, by definition, it's not strictly necessary. In a business optimized purely around efficiency, you never do anything unless it's strictly necessary. The problem with things that are strictly necessary is that everybody else does them, and they're incredibly dull. I hope that's useful. This is my kind of philosophy, and that's been me. Thank you very much indeed.
Hi, Rory. Thanks so much. I'm Harriet from Butternut Box. We're a subscription D2C pet food brand.
Oh, wow.
We're a category leader. We created it. It's fresh dog food. We cook it. It goes in your freezer. But we're now in the unique position where we now have a lot of competitors that are copying us. So things like we send flowers when your dog passes away, the unexpected. Competitors now doing the thing. Or they're attacking us for things like our weaknesses. So it needs to be stored in the freezer. So they're marketing heavily on our weaknesses. What would you do about these things when you're the market leader and have competitors?
One really interesting thing, is it that you're losing customers or that you're finding them harder to acquire?
Harder to acquire, so CPAs are higher.
You're up against something there which is really interesting to me, which is, in the UK particularly, the complete and ridiculous vilification of frozen food. And by the way, it's a weirdly UK phenomenon. So if you go to France, there's a company called Picard. If you actually shop on Ocado, you can buy Picard stuff. And their equivalent of sort of M&S high-end ready meals is like our Iceland. It's all frozen. And one thing that would actually be of considerable environmental benefit, apart from anything else, would be if, along with companies perhaps like Nomad Foods, one of my problems with the advertising industry is all budgets are brand budgets. But a lot of problems are category problems. And I think there's a really, really interesting category problem to be solved because if you think about it, it's much more profitable for supermarkets. So the chilled supply chain is a pain in the arse, whereas the frozen supply chain is really, really easy. The whole shelf life of things makes it much easier. I've always wondered if there was a kind of trade body where you could actually effectively all gang together with a load of people like Cook and other people who make frozen food and just do a PR combined with maybe a radio campaign pointing out that actually the best way to preserve food isn't by adding a load of chemicals, it's to freeze it. Because it's one of those weird things where I always made the point about the electric vehicle transition, which is every single ad for electric vehicles was run by an electric vehicle manufacturer. And they were thinking of themselves as competing with other electric vehicle manufacturers. So what do they all talk about? Range. So what the collective effect of all, you know what I said earlier, that something that's individually rational can be collectively stupid, okay? The collective effect of that was that everybody was talking about the one element where electric cars are slightly inferior to petrol cars. See? So there's this whole discussion about range. So the entire market was focusing the consumer's attention not on the fact of quietness, performance, energy efficiency, all those fantastic things, incredibly low cost of use. Instead, everybody was focused on the one negative. And consequently, there's a theory about this, which is that what happened in Britain is that the first ready meals came from Marks and Spencer, and they tended to be fresh ready meals, for whatever reason. And M&S, being very big, could actually have the throughput which made it all work. And the consumer inferred from that because M&S did fresh ready meals, that fresh ready meals were therefore better. And so your competitors are often doing literally fresh food that's delivered, if I'm right, it's delivered.
Yes, they're calling it fresh, but it can be stored in your cupboard, essentially, and so you can take out and feed it to your dog straight away.
I see, got it.
So because the category is kind of brand new, which we've defined over the last 10 years, there's not a regulation of what you can and can't call it.
Okay, I'm going to think about that, but that's very, very interesting because it is one of those cases where, a bit like the old paceometer, people, and I'll tell you the other thing that happened. I mentioned the M&S story. Because it's more efficient to distribute frozen food was cheaper. And people inferred from that because it's cheaper, therefore it's not as good. Simple as that, you know. I mean, genuinely was that issue. The French and Picard and a few other people, maybe Cook, have managed to actually achieve a kind of escape velocity from that weird prejudice. But it's a really, really interesting psychological framing issue. I mean, to be honest, you're much less likely to have waste, aren't you, as well?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's great. But it's more like, should we go after them in our marketing to say fresh is best, like frozen is fresh, if it's in the shelf, that's fake news, kind of thing? Or is it best to just let them try and get on with it and double down on what we're doing?
This is the tragedy of the thing. An awful lot of fresh food has been frozen. I think that's true of pretty much all fish, isn't it?
Yeah, all fish.
If you basically buy fish and you go, oh, it's fresh fish, unless you're going to a super specialist fishmonger or you're on the kind of quayside at, you know, some Cornish place, it's basically been frozen, and then they thaw it to pretend it's fresh. So this actually is a case where I think people have been woefully misled. And now, interestingly, because you've got an existing customer base, with your existing customer base, you can make that case really well. In terms of the preservation of nutrients, everything else, it's a really, really fantastic way to store food. Fundamentally, of course, what they're doing is it's ready to serve. I suppose there's the convenience issue. But happy to think about that more. Oh.
Sorry, I think we have time for a very quick one, so I'm choosing.
Sorry, I'm Laura. I'm the head of school at First Bus and First Group, so it was very interesting to hear your experience about buses. But one of the questions that I kind of quickly had was, I guess people always expect that public transport is a bad experience. It's all gone.
The public sector?
Oh, sorry, public, or like just the public in general have a bad experience of it. Is some. I guess I'd be interested to know, how do you think that we should change people's behaviour before they come onto the bus? And also, how do we get them on the bus more often?
The fundamental problem is that people judge things according to their expectation of something, not their real experience. And you know, I think Octopus Energy is doing something very smart there. I'm amazed at how few people do it. The real battle, though, I think is internal. And the reason I think the real battle is internal is that most people in jobs in a business, particularly a publicly run business which has kind of quarterly reporting and all that stuff, fundamentally think that your job is to be efficient. In other words, to minimize cost, not to maximize value. And 90%, I would say 90% of effort in a business is towards value extraction or cost cutting, or possibly regulatory paranoia, and only 10% gets devoted towards value creation. One suggestion I've got is a structural one. Cheryl, who's the marketing director at Aviva, every day for the whole board has a customer day. And the whole board spends a whole day focusing on customers. Now, I used to think the answer is, well, just get marketing people on the board. The problem is that even if you do have marketing people on the board, only 3% of that board meeting will be devoted to marketing, because anybody been in a board meeting? It's basically a male masturbatory contest for balance sheet appraisal. And also, if you make the other thing I learned to my cost is if you make a marketing comment in a board meeting, it's a bit like farting, and because everybody's going, we're 3.75, and this is slightly down on last year. And you go, have you thought of painting it pink? Okay, and you look like the nutter in the room. So I think Cheryl's idea of I would actually have a separate customer board. And there would be considerable overlap with the main board. I'd also have an employee board, but that's a different matter. Okay? But I think that companies need to have a customer board, which is just focused on customers. Family-owned businesses do that automatically. Why? Because they don't have shareholders, so they spend all their time thinking about customers. Conventional businesses, the customer comes second to the shareholder in every single consideration they make. So I think a way of creating... The most valuable thing I always thought about my time talking about behavioral science was to create space for the conversation. The real value of behavioral science wasn't what I did or what my team did. It was that when we went into a business and talked about this stuff, from then on it was permissible to say, we're assuming that if we drop the price, demand will go up, but shouldn't we test putting the price up too? Because sometimes when you put the price up, demand goes up. Mark Ritson is, a huge devotee. The psychology of price is unbelievably complicated. To an economist, price is a number. To a customer, it's a feeling. One bit of advice to anybody here, just use Klarna. I'm not paid by them, by the way. Do you know why? Now, an economist would go, it's an interest-free loan over 3 months. Now, 3 times £150 is a totally different price to £450. Okay? It feels different. It's a completely different calculus. And I know that because I was buying one of those Dyson air purifier heater things, and it was 450 quid. And that's bollocks, I'm not paying that. And it said 3 times £150. I said, well, that sounds quite reasonable. I've been studying these biases for ages. So getting enough senior time outside the marketing function to focus on issues of psychology and actually... interesting question. In a way, I think one of the biggest marks of a really successful company is often that they overpay their call center staff because they realize the value of longevity and experience. That would be one example. Now, this is how bad it's got. I'll end on this because it's quite depressing, but it's important. So a friend of mine was a kind of consultant, and he was working with a B2B company, and he had done huge amounts of research among their customers. No, this is last point. Okay. And he said, look, you're not actually that good at what you do, but your customer service is fantastic, and that's why all your customers are with you. And the guy who was his direct client said, you can't present that to the board. I said, well... I've just spent months doing this. It's true. Why can't I tell the board? He said, because last month we agreed in our strategy that our whole strategy for the next year was to reduce customer service costs so we'd increase our margin. Right? Now, I can see those conversations happening with AI particularly. To be honest, the pisser with tech is tech has provided a narrative to support cost cutting for the last 20 years. Because normally you go, well, if we spend less on this, we'll be worse at it. And that was how people traditionally looked at that. And then we have this weird deus ex machina, which is called tech, which is to go, the great thing about tech is we can spend less on things and nobody will notice. And it's one of those things that's true for a bit, right up to the point when it isn't. Okay? So this is something we've all got to be really, really alert and fight our corner here, I think. That's the most important thing.
Thank you, Rory.
A pleasure. Thank you very much indeed.